Most defendants accept their fate and move on. But when Pam Bondi was suddenly slapped with a hefty fine, she didn't just take it. She fought back with such precision that even the judge began questioning his own ruling. Pam never expected the day to take such a turn. Courtroom 3B in Tampa's courthouse was supposed to be just another stop in her schedule. A routine hearing, nothing more. She'd been here countless times before, facing judges with varying degrees of experience. Nothing about today seemed out of the ordinary. Seated at the defendant's table, she kept her expression neutral, scanning a few notes. Across from her, the city attorney adjusted his tie, shifting uncomfortably as he waited for the judge. This was a minor dispute, a procedural matter that should have been over in minutes. Then Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, and instantly, Pam knew something was off. Dalton commanded the room without effort, tall, graying beard, piercing eyes. His presence alone was enough to shift the atmosphere. Normally, judges took a moment to settle in, acknowledge the attorneys, and review files. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he said, his voice flat, expression unreadable. Pam straightened, slightly. "The court has reviewed the matter," Dalton continued, "and after considering the arguments, I find the defendant in violation of Local Statute 14B. A fine of $10,000 is due immediately." Silence. Pam's brow lifted ever so slightly. Inside, her mind was already racing. She had expected a discussion, maybe even a warning, but this? A ruling without a single argument? The city attorney glanced at her, almost apologetic. Even he hadn't expected the case to move this fast. Pam calmly folded her hands. Her voice was steady. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my defense." Dalton barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly. The room was too still. She wasn't one to lose her composure, but something about this felt deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling. It was a statement. She studied Dalton. Behind his eyes, there was something more than judicial authority. He wasn't just enforcing the law. He was putting her in her place. Pam's voice remained measured but firm. "If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if expecting her pushback. His lips curled, not quite a smile. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you the outcome will be the same." And that's when Pam knew. This wasn't just about the case. It was about her, adjusting her papers not because she needed to, but for effect. She met Dalton's gaze head-on. "Then I suppose we should begin." Tension thickened. The city attorney shifted in his seat, uneasy. The court stenographer sat up straighter. Even the few spectators leaned forward, sensing something unusual was about to unfold. Pam took one last glance at the legal brief before her. Not that she needed it. She already knew her next move. Dalton thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Pam let the silence stretch just long enough to make an impact. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. Then, with deliberate ease, she turned a page in her folder before looking up at Dalton. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Are you saying that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" Dalton's expression remained unchanged. "I'm saying the violation is clear, and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then she nodded. "Interesting." Dalton's brow lifted. "Excuse me?" Pam leaned back just enough to appear composed but confident. "It's just, I've been practicing law for quite some time," she said casually, "and in all those years I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it." She paused. "What's the phrase? Unprecedented?" Dalton's jaw tightened. And just like that, the power in the room shifted. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him, yet. She was setting the stage, forcing him to react. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and clerks waiting for their cases, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had likely witnessed thousands of hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton let out a slow breath. "Ms. Bondi, this courtroom is not a stage for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands, and we move on." Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He had opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, though. This time she didn't look down at them, she looked straight at the judge. "Very well," she said smoothly. "Let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated." She tapped a finger against the document in front of her. "You say? The law is clear. That's interesting because this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years, with conflicting rulings." Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly. "For example," Pam continued, her voice calm but deliberate, "the language in subsection C is so vague that it has been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases." She let the silence stretch before adding, "And let's not forget the appellate court ruling last year, which found that imposing fines under this statute without due process is a direct violation of constitutional protections." The courtroom was silent. Pam could feel the shift. Dalton felt it too. The judge straightened, his tone sharpening. "Those cases do not apply here." Pam didn't blink, "Don't they?" She turned another page. "Because from where I'm sitting, they seem quite relevant. The ruling in Reynolds versus Clearwater was explicit. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds." She let the words settle before adding, "And I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to disregard legal precedent." Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam let that hang in the air for just a moment before delivering the next blow. "Unless, of course, this court is prepared to ignore established case law," she said lightly. "In which case, I'd be happy to file an appeal." Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. "Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Ms. Bondi?" Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh without amusement. "Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law." A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but significant. She had shifted the power dynamic. Dalton was no longer just issuing rulings. He was being forced to defend them. The city attorney, who had been silent up until now, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off. His eyes stayed locked on Pam's. Long pause, then finally the judge spoke. "Very well, you may present your defense." Pam smiled. Just slightly. She wasn't celebrating, not yet. This was only the beginning. But then Dalton did something that made it clear he wouldn't make this easy. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Proceed," he said. His voice was steady, but it carried a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about control, and she had no intention of backing down. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him yet. She was setting the stage, forcing him to respond. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and clerks waiting for their cases, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had likely seen 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton let out a slow breath. "Miss Bondi, this court does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands, and we move on." Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He had opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time she didn't look down. She looked directly at the judge. "Very well, let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated." She tapped her finger on the printed document in front of her. "You say the law is clear. That's interesting because this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years, with varying interpretations." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "For example," Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational, "the language in subsection C is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases." A pause. And let's not forget that just last year, an appellate court ruled that imposing fines under this statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom was silent. Pam could feel the shift happening. The judge knew it too. Dalton straightened, his tone sharpening. Those cases do not apply here. Pam didn't miss a beat. Don't they? She turned a page. Because from where I'm sitting, they do. The language in Reynolds versus Clearwater was clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words settle before adding, and I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore precedent. Dalton clenched his jaw. Pam let that hang in the air for just a second before delivering the next blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case, I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Miss Bondi? Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet, humorless laugh. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but important. She had shifted the power dynamic. She had forced the judge to defend his position rather than simply issuing rulings without question. Dalton knew it too. The city attorney, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off, his eyes locked on Pam's. A long pause. Then finally the judge spoke. Very well. You may present your defense. Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear he wasn't going to make this easy. He didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about control. He wanted to make sure she understood exactly where she stood in his courtroom. But Pam Bondi wasn't the type to be intimidated. She adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Let's start with the language of the statute itself. She tapped her papers. Local Statute 14b claims that any entity failing to comply with a municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough. But the issue arises in how compliance is defined. She let the words sink in before continuing. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, unimpressed. And yet, Miss Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly, without issue. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting, because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She glanced at the city attorney, then back at Dalton. Unless, of course, you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Miss Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. Pam allowed a beat of silence before responding. Except when it isn't. A murmur from the back of the room. Pam reached for another document, holding it up. Let's talk about Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. She let the name hang in the air for a moment before continuing. The defendant in that case was fined under this very statute. Same wording, same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused, then added, You know what the judge said in that ruling? She didn't wait for a response. That the law as applied fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unenforceable under scrutiny. Dalton's expression remained blank, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The city attorney leaned forward. Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked. Pam turned her gaze toward him, cutting him off before he could continue. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. She gestured toward the document in front of her. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please. Enlighten us." The attorney hesitated. His silence spoke volumes. Pam turned back to Dalton. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency." She let that settle before delivering the final push. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton sat back, scanning her, calculating. Pam knew exactly what he was doing. Stalling. Trying to find an angle to regain control. Finally, he spoke. "The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours." Pam didn't blink. "True. But the precedent applies all the same." Silence. The weight in the room had shifted. Pam knew she had him cornered. Not just because he was legally wrong, though he was, but because she had forced him into a position where any decision he made would be scrutinized. He could push forward, ignore precedent, and risk having his ruling overturned. Or he could backpedal, conceding that he had acted prematurely. Dalton let out a slow breath. "Miss Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable." Pam smiled slightly. "Then let's debate it." Dalton's nostrils flared ever so slightly. Then to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. "The court will take a 15-minute recess." He stood before anyone could argue, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. Pam set her papers down, her expression calm. Inside, she knew exactly what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to give in. But he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone. And what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. They hadn't just brought in someone with more authority. They had strategically reinforced their position. Now they were attempting to counter her argument with an overlooked technicality. Pam folded her hands, her voice steady. "I'm aware of that ruling, Your Honor. But I also know that the clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, standards that, in this case, were not met." Judge Whitaker nodded, as if he had anticipated her response. "Then let's talk about that. The enforcement officer who filed this violation is present in the courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him?" Pam concealed her surprise. She hadn't expected that, but she welcomed it. Turning her head, she watched as a man rose from the back of the room. Officer Brian Calloway, municipal enforcement, middle-aged, crisp navy uniform, the self-assured demeanor of someone unaccustomed to having his authority questioned. "Yes, Your Honor," Pam said, her voice calm. Dalton gestured for Calloway to approach. The officer took the stand, swore his oath, and sat. Pam walked toward him slowly, deliberately. "Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you issued this violation?" "Yes, ma'am." Pam turned slightly toward the public gallery. "And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred?" Calloway exhaled, as if the answer were obvious. "The statute is clear. The property was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine." Pam clasped her hands behind her back. "Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation?" A pause. "No, ma'am. It wasn't necessary." She offered a small, almost amused smile. "You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine?" Calloway shifted in his seat. "I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw." Pam kept her expression neutral, though inside she knew she had just been handed the perfect argument. Turning back to the bench, she spoke with quiet precision. "Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. This directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the appellate clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier." Whitaker's expression remained unchanged, but he leaned back slightly. He knew she was right. Pam pressed on. "So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench. He wasn't looking at Whitaker. That told Pam everything. He had expected to control the argument, had expected Whitaker's presence to force her into a corner. Instead, she had taken his own counterpoint and unraveled the case against her. Dalton exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. They were running out of ways to push back, but she knew this wasn't over. When they reconvened, Dalton would have something up his sleeve, and whatever it was, she would be ready. Are you stating, for the record, that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof, directly contradicting established appellate precedent? Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. Ms. Bondi, this court has discretion. Pam's lips curved into a knowing smile. It does. But discretion is not immunity from legal standards. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this was going. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the bench. Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based solely on their word. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion. Dalton remained silent, and that told her everything she needed to know. She turned toward the gallery, letting her gaze sweep across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders who had sat through the hearing. Imagine the implications. A business owner fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner penalized for something they can't even verify. And if they challenge it? Too bad. The court has discretion. A few heads in the gallery nodded subtly. Pam turned, back to Dalton. That's not discretion, Your Honor, that's unchecked authority. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Whitaker finally spoke. You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process, Pam nodded. Not just due process, judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, the legal system itself begins to erode. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. He knew he was backed into a corner. The city attorney cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton held up a hand. His expression remained unreadable, but the frustration in his eyes was unmistakable. There was no winning this. Not for him. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled. This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement. His voice was stiff, reluctant. The fine is overturned. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction, no gloating. Just quiet certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she reached the exit, Dalton's voice cut through the room. One last time. Ms. Bondi. She turned. Their eyes met. I underestimated you, he admitted. Pam gave him a small smile. You wouldn't be the first. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she exited the courtroom. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain. This case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond this courtroom. Somewhere, in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. As Pam strode down the marble hallway, her pace steady, her mind remained sharp. This hearing had started as routine, but what it became was a battle of power, law, and ego. And she had won, but she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget losses like these, especially not in front of a full courtroom. Just as she neared the courthouse exit, a voice called out behind her. Ms. Bondi, a moment. She turned to find Judge Whitaker approaching, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't the type for unnecessary small talk. If he was stopping her now, it wasn't just to exchange pleasantries. Pam crossed her arms loosely. Something on your mind? Whitaker studied her for a long moment before speaking. You're good. Pam smiled slightly. I try. He nodded, glancing briefly at the courtroom doors behind him before lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. I wasn't brought in to observe, Ms. Bondi. I was brought in to contain. Pam raised an eyebrow. Contain what? Exactly. Whitaker exhaled, his gaze steady. Judge Dalton doesn't like losing. And this wasn't just about a fine, it was about setting an example. Pam had suspected as much. Hearing it confirmed only made the victory feel more significant. She kept her voice even. So what happens now? Whitaker hesitated, then gave her a look that held both respect and warning. You'll have people watching you, he said, and not just here. Pam understood exactly what he meant. Today she hadn't just won a case. She had challenged a system that thrived on compliance. And that would not go unnoticed. She gave Whitaker a single nod. I appreciate the heads up. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the courthouse into whatever came next. Whitaker gave her one last look before turning back toward the courtroom. Pam faced the exit, pushing open the heavy courthouse doors and stepping into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first battle she had fought in court, and it wouldn't be the last. But today's fight carried a lesson, one she hoped others had witnessed. Power wasn't about who sat behind the bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. True power lay in understanding the rules well enough to challenge them. It was in standing firm when others expected you to fold. And most importantly, it was in knowing that just because someone hands you a ruling doesn't mean you have to accept it. Pam Bondi had walked into that courtroom expecting a routine hearing. She walked out having reminded everyone, especially those in power, that the law wasn't just about enforcement. It was about understanding. It was about pushing back. And today, she had done just that. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because in every courtroom behind every case, there's always more than meets the eye.